If you grew up in the 1990s, there was one voice that could instantly stop you in your tracks. One man who represented the absolute gold standard of authority, wisdom, and tough love. George Feeny. For 7 seasons of Boy Meets World, Mr. Feeny wasn't just a background character. He was the gravity that kept the entire show afloat. He was the ultimate mentor, but if you actually sit and look at his career timeline, the math makes absolutely no sense. He somehow managed to follow the exact core of kids from 6th grade through high school and directly into college. It's one of the most hilarious, unrealistic teaching careers in television history. But behind the iconic catchphrases, the jackets, the strict, unyielding rules, there was a deeply complex, incredible, tragic man. Today we're looking past the backyard fence to uncover the real story of George Feeny, the exact year he was born, the devastating loss that shaped his entire life, and the true legacy of his 40-year career. To truly understand why Mr. Feeny was so incredibly strict, you have to look at where he came from. George Feeny was a proud Boston native who eventually attended Harvard University, graduating at the top of his class. Now, the show itself never explicitly flashes a birth certificate on screen, but based upon concrete historical lore dropping throughout the series, we can pinpoint his exact era. We know George served in the military during World War II. To hit those historical milestones, George Feeny had to have been born around 1925 to 1927. The timeline beautifully mirrors the legendary actor who brought him to life, William Daniels, who was born in 1927. While Daniels grew up in Brooklyn, he brought the sharp, old-school, mid-Atlantic academic discipline to the role. When Feeny eventually packed his bags and moved to Philadelphia to enter the public school system, he brought the classic New England discipline with him. He treated 6th graders like they were law students. He expected them to understand Magna Carta, Shakespeare, and the human condition. He wasn't just interested in being liked, he was interested in forging proper citizens. But for the first few seasons, he was almost robotic in his discipline. He lived entirely alone. He spent his evenings obsessively tending to his backyard garden. He built a literal and emotional wall around himself. And so it turns out he had a heartbreaking reason for doing so. For years, fans just assumed Mr. Feeny was a lifelong bachelor who simply preferred his own company. But hidden deep within the show's lore is a tragedy that completely recontextualizes his entire character. Back in his 20s, George fell deeply in love with a woman named Lillian. She was his absolute universe. In December of 1961, the young couple took a romantic 3-day weekend getaway to a small island cabin in the Poconos, a place George would keep for the rest of his life. A few years later, they were married, and on their wedding anniversary on February 14, 1965, Lillian bought George a beautiful wristwatch. Tragically, she passed away not long after. George was utterly devastated. The man who had an answer for every single problem in life was completely powerless against grief. In his diary, he wrote that the glass on the watch face caught her reflection, and while the watch would keep time, her smile would reflect in its face forever. He locked that pain away in absolute silence, but he never let go. Mr. Feeny wore that wristwatch every day for the rest of his life. When you realize it changes the entire way you view the early seasons of Boy Meets World, his obsession with guarding the property line, his rigid adherence to rules, the isolation. It wasn't just because he was a mean old man. He built the walls so he would never have to feel that kind of loss ever again. But then a kid named Cory Matthews had a baseball through his fence. Instead of pulling away, George Feeny let his students break these walls down. For the kids who had stable homes like Cory, Feeny was a challenge to push them further. But for the kids who had absolutely nothing like Shawn Hunter, Feeny became an absolute anchor. He became the father figure Shawn desperately needed to keep from falling through the cracks of the system. So for how long did he actually carry the torch? By the time the series concluded in the year 2000, George Feeny had been teaching for over 40 years. Think about the sheer endurance of that. He tried to retire. At the end of season 5, he genuinely packed his bags, bought a plot of land in Wyoming, ready to finally walk away and live out the rest of his days in peace. But teaching wasn't just his job, it was his calling. When Pembroke University offered him a professorship, he couldn't stay away. He realized his life's work wasn't finished until he saw his final, most chaotic class safely across the finish line into adulthood. We are happy to report that George's story didn't end in isolation. In the show's later years, he finally opened his sacred heart again, falling in love and marrying Dean Lila Bolander. In one of the most beautiful pieces of television history, Dean Bolander was played by actress Bonnie Bartlett, William Daniels' actual real-life wife. Their two are still happily married today. Also, William Daniels just celebrated recently his 99th birthday. But what makes George Feeny one of the most powerful characters in television history isn't just that he survived his past, it's that he used his own broken heart to shelter a new generation. You can see the absolute weight of his impact in the series finale in a scene that still tears the hearts out of everyone who grew up in the 90s. The kids are leaving for New York, and they gather in the classroom for one last time, begging him for one final lesson. Even at the very end, Feeny tries to maintain his stoic professional boundary, but the barrier completely breaks down. Look at how they all speak to him. Topanga steps up and tells him, "You've been more of a father figure to me than you know." Shawn, the kid the world wanted to write off, but whom Feeny fiercely protected, shakes his hand and simply says, "You never gave up on me." And then there's Eric, the chaotic older brother who hid his massive heart behind a wall of humor. He refuses to leave the room until Mr. Feeny admits what they all know deep down. Eric looks at him in the eyes and whispers, "I'm always going to think of you as my friend." That is the true power of George Feeny. For 40 years, he poured his soul into the students, demanding excellence because he knew the world would be unforgiving to them if he wasn't. And in return, those kids did what no one else could. They healed the old, grieving Bostonian who spent decades hiding behind a backyard fence. Before they walk out the door for the last time, he leaves them and us with the ultimate blueprint for a meaningful life. Believe in yourself, dream, try, do good. When Cory instinctively tries to correct him one last time and asking, "Don't you mean do well?" Feeny offers him the absolute final immortal correction, "No, do good." George Feeny speaks into the empty air, letting us hear the words he could never bring himself to say to their faces. I love you all. Class dismissed.